As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We have a returning guest, Mike Rivero, founder of WhatReallyHappened.com, a site that debunks the myths and separates fact from fiction in the news, is back with us here again on Reluctant Preppers. Thanks for joining us again, Mike.
Thank you for having me again.
Today, I'd like to address with you the topic of how real is the threat of terrorism. As preppers, a lot of people, especially reluctant preppers, are wanting to know the reality, to be aware of the truth, and so they can be prepared for credible threats that are real risks and not just jumping at every shadow that, it seems like year after year, decade after decade, it's this or that or the other disease is going to be the thing that wipes out the planet, and they all just go by the wayside, and it just seems like it's sort of, a lot of it is flash in the pan news, that kind of thing.
Well, it's marketing. It's marketing to sell vaccines. We saw that back in 2009 with the When Pigs Fly flu, which is my name for it because it was a splice of pig, human, and avian flu viruses together. And it was heralded it was going to be a pandemic, and then we found out the World Health Organization actually lowered the threshold of what constituted a pandemic so they could scare everybody out into buying lots and lots of Tamiflu. And Roche Pharmaceuticals made a huge amount of money off of this. And in the end, the 2009 When Pigs Fly flu turned out to actually be milder than the normal seasonal flu. And Tamiflu turned out to be no more effective against that flu than over-the-counter acetaminophen. So, a lot of this scaring that we're seeing in the media is all about selling a product or selling agenda. We're seeing another flood of news stories about how May was the hottest month on record, according to NOAA, and they're rushing all this out because we actually had snow fall here in Hawaii last Wednesday. And during the winter, yes, we do get snow up on those upper peaks on the Big Island and Maui, but snow falling on Hawaii in June, that is really causing consternation among the people pushing human-caused global warming. So they're out there with that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't real possibilities of disaster. I mean, certainly natural disasters can and do happen all the time. And the idea of a credible threat, well, if you look at modern ocean liner, or any ocean liner, they carry lifeboats. Now, nobody is really thinking that there's going to be a ship sinking, but you have lifeboats anyway, just in case, even though it's not really a credible problem. And so it's an idea, and I understand being a prepper does take a lot of work, a lot of cost. You have to acquire prepper materials. You have to train to use them, because when the disaster is happening is a really rotten time to be reading that instruction manual. And, of course, in the case of your food and water supplies, there's the constant checking to make sure that they're staying fresh and safe and usable. But, again, it's like buying an insurance policy. When you buy an insurance policy on your home, you're not expecting your home to have a fire or to be broken into or to be hit by a flood. But it's just a way of knowing that you're prepared to deal with these situations. And, of course, you know the joke. How do you tell who a prepper is? They're the ones not eating out of the trash dumpsters following a disaster.
Well, we certainly want to be among that, to be counted in that number. Clearly we could do a broader show, and we should, to walk through the many different arenas that could be perceived as threats, and kind of take a temperature on how real those likely are, how likely those specifically are, versus do we know of any specific, agendas and narratives that are of conflict of interest that are driving some of that. Specifically, if we could zero in for this conversation on the purported threat of terrorism. It's been ever since 9/11. It's come right onto our radar, and it's been there ever since. The national threat level, it seems like, has seldom varied from orange, which is the second from highest level. Almost nightly, we have on the evening news stories of additional atrocities committed by ISIS, or if you're the president or his press secretary, ISIL. And if you could explain us why they won't use the same terminology. There's been huge debates between Donald Trump and pressure on others as far as why they won't call radical Islamism what it is, versus couching it as some sort of domestic criminal behavior or things like that. But just from the standpoint of a person living in the U.S. wanting to keep their family safe, how much of this, if you could kind of take us through a pretty thorough overview of how much of this is that kind of hyperbole and hype that you've pointed out in other areas, versus how much of this is something we really need to pay attention to, and in fact maybe being spun by the media because it doesn't fit other narratives.
Well, you need to look at the way politics works. Anytime there's any kind of an incident, the first thing a politician is going to be thinking is, how can I use this to push my agenda? And so when something happens at the Orlando, like the Orlando Pulse shooting last weekend, everybody's jumping on it to push their own particular agenda. The early reports out were, this was a homophobic assault. This guy hated gays, and that's why he went in and shot the people. And then it turns out he's gay himself and was a regular customer at the club. So the ACLU is out there blaming the Christians, and Obama wants to blame the guns, and that's why he wants to focus off of Muslims. And in this case, it's legitimate. This guy was born in New York. He spent his entire life in the United States, and he worked for a security company. He wasn't on the no-fly list. He had passed the background check for a Florida state firearms license, plus 2 background checks for his employer, plus apparently some involvement with the FBI. In fact, he and some of his associates may have been undercover FBI informants. And you need to realize that lately there have been a lot of retired FBI and CIA coming on out and saying the reality is most of these terror attacks and mass shootings are in fact manufactured events to push certain agendas, goad us toward war, get us to surrender our guns to the government, and so forth. But from the point of view of being a prepper, it almost doesn't really matter what the cause of these incidents is. They are going to happen. Now, in the case of government false flags, they tend to be rather tightly controlled. But it's still going to be there. Now, in the case of an act of terror or mass shooting, the only preparation you can have there is to basically the ability to defend yourself, which is exactly what the government is trying to take away from you. But getting away from mass shootings and into acts of terror that involve our critical infrastructure, there's an issue that preppers do need to be looking at. The idea that somebody could blow up a power station, so you'd be without electricity for a while. You would have no power to run your refrigeration freezers at home to preserve your food unless you got a generator. And, these are issues that you should be looking at. And the other, actually, I think the most prevalent threat everybody should be looking at right now is a collapse of our economy, because the globally linked private central bank-based economy is straining at the edges, and you need to be looking at what's going on in Venezuela right now, where their economy locked up and the supply chains broke down, and people are in serious, serious trouble. And it could very, very easily happen here. And there's an aspect you need to keep in mind. During the Depression of the 1930s, the American population was still pretty much spread across rural America. There were always nearby farm fields that you could grow food and so forth. But here in the 2000s, in 2016, most Americans have been sort of rounded up and herded into these giant human ranches called cities, where there are no alternatives to the corporate supply chain for food, water, electricity. And so the effects of an economic lockup are going to actually be far worse today than they were back in the 1930s. And people really do need to be dealing with that as well. So that really is a good reason for being prepared to go off grid. And it's hard to do because our government wants to encourage us to be dependent on corporations and government because that is the means by which we're controlled. And we're seeing some rather ridiculous situations out there where some states have now literally criminalized the collecting of rainwater on your own property because they want you dependent on that tap water. And yet we know from Flint, Michigan, what's coming out of that faucet into your home is actually very, very dangerous. And one thing all you preppers ought to do, and we did it out here, you can go out on the internet and on eBay, and you can get a water testing kit for about $20. And it's a one-time test, and it tests for lead content, microbial content, a bunch of other heavy metals, water hardness, and a bunch of other things. And just run a test on what's coming out of your tap and just see what's going on. Because following the revelations of that water crisis in Flint, Michigan, where there's just huge amounts of lead in that water, which causes permanent neurological damage. Aaron Brockovich is already starting an operation where they've collected water from all across America, and they're saying this is an epidemic across the country. Our government for 14, 15 years, even longer than that, has been running a wartime economy where all the money taken from the American people is being used to prop up Wall Street, prop up Israel, and fund all of these wars of aggression across the globe. And as is always the practice in wartime economy, maintenance and care of the infrastructure is what they politely refer to as deferred. They're not actually taking care of the systems, and they figure after the war is over and they've declared victory, then they'll go on back and they'll make everything all right again. But we saw this in World War I and World War II. And we're seeing it again right now, where the safety and quality of the water coming out of these corporate supplies is very questionable. And you need to know what's in that water. And you need to either have filtration or you need to find some other source of water. But again, in a lot of states, it's actually now a criminal offense to collect rainwater from the sky, which is about the best and safest water you can get anywhere.
In addition to those common sense preparedness of food and shelter and securing your water supply, just still pressing you a little bit further on, do you have, from your research and contacts, awareness that people can give some insight to kind of recalibrate their emergency senses about how real of a credible threat to our, domestic source of supply chain and stability of our culture is of these various terrorist threats that we're talked about all the time on the news?
Well, again, the terror threat is again more of this hype. The U.S. is desperate to escalate the war situation. The American people are sick and tired of war. We've had 13, 14 years of war on some 17 countries that we know of. There's a lot of covert overthrow and drone striking going on that we still don't know about. So a lot of that really is just outright fear-mongering. And again, an individual terror attack, unless you are present on the scene, it's not going to affect you directly. Unless the terror attack, real or staged, hits infrastructure, like blowing up a water supply, blowing up a power station, taking down the internet, then it's going to affect you, and you need to be sort of analyzing how badly would that affect you. I mean, a lot of people would be completely lost without their internet connection. A lot of people would just simply say, who cares? I don't use it all that much. So you need to sort of evaluate it basically on the needs of what your family is, how many people are there, how much supplies they're going to need. And we understand that, again, the issue of terrorism is a propaganda tool to try and get us all to go back to hating ISIS and Al-Qaeda and seeing them as an enemy. And one of the reasons we're getting that right now, of course, are the revelations that are coming out of the lawsuit into Hillary Clinton's email server, in which it has come out. We have official U.S. government documents that at the same time Obama and Hillary Clinton were telling us ISIS and Al-Qaeda were our dire enemies, and they were coming up with all these videotapes of fake beheadings to scare us with, the U.S. government was actually sending weapons to ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria in their efforts to oust Assad and replace him with a U.S. puppet. So there's a lot of duplicity going on in there. And so much of the terrorist coverage in the news really is overblown. I think in terms of evaluating a real threat, you need to look at, obviously, the natural disasters, which we know are real and do happen, and the very real possibility that there's going to be a serious global economic disruption. And I think you really do need to be more focused on that than on the possibility that there's going to be a terror attack somewhere around you.
Beyond the individual and the individual's family, and maybe we'll take it one step at a time, do you have experience and advice from people you've talked with about sort of winning over? I mean, your whole website, your whole mission there is to kind of get out an alternative way of seeing reality than what we're being led to. So even within an individual family, if you have one person, the head of the family often, who may have these concerns or these awarenesses, and those aren't shared because everybody else is just kind of going with the flow, just taking advantage of all the comforts and distractions that are present in our affluent society. Taking that one step of how do you win over your family to taking some of these other ways of looking at things seriously, and then secondly, how do you talk to extended family, friends, coworkers who may think that you've gone off the deep end if you're concerned about some of these things. So if you could start within your own family first, how do you address that?
Well, first of all, there's an art and a skill to educating people and luring them away from the matrix back to the real world. And it requires patience, one at a time. Don't overwhelm people. One of the ways that government mentally enslaves their population is by raising them in a way where their own sense of identity is very much tied up with the government and the political structure. And the proof of that is in the language. People don't go around saying, I support the Republican platform or I support the Democratic platform. They say, I am a Republican, I am a Democrat. Their identity is becoming entangled with the political structure. And that's why when you talk to a lot of people and you challenge their indoctrinated dogma, they will actually react as if it's a personal attack. And so you have to be very, very careful about that. The good news is, though, you don't really need to talk about economic disruption and a possible collapse of the government, because the preparations you would be making for an economic or political collapse are virtually identical to those that you're going to be making for a natural disaster. So if your family doesn't want to hear about what's going on in the dark recesses of the government, just do your prepping anyway and say, this is for a possible hurricane, because this is hurricane season out here in Hawaii, or we live in an earthquake zone, or there are tornadoes, this and that. And just say, again, it's the lifeboat analogy. I don't really think anything bad is going to happen to our ocean liner here, but let's just have the lifeboats just in case. And it's very hard for people to argue against that. And I know a lot of families are dealing with serious economic difficulty. And so there's going to be an issue of how do you prep and make it affordable so that it's not impacting other aspects of your life. But I think most people, if you don't go into details about politics and economics, are going to be okay with having prepper supplies for the same reason you have a fire extinguisher, in your kitchen or your bedroom. And you don't think you're ever going to need it, and in all probability you never will, but you still have it. That's it.
Well, Mike, before we let you go, are there other thoughts around this arena of what's real concerns versus what's hype that you can help give us perspective
Well,
on?
again, the art of the rabble-rouser is in knowing what the rabble is ready to listen to and what they're not ready to listen to, and you have to walk a very, very fine line. You also need to understand that there are people out there who are, because of their own financial entanglements, they don't want to know things that the government is doing. And anybody on a government paycheck, they're very highly paid relative to the private sector for the same work. They don't want to lose that and give that up. So educating the public is a very tricky, careful process. It is working, though. More and more Americans, in fact, this is spreading all across the globe. They're becoming aware of the true nature of their societies, of the oligarchical nature of politics in general. We're seeing in this country where Republican and Democratic voters are just absolutely furious at the way the national committees of both parties are basically saying, we don't care what candidate you want. We will pick the candidate, and if you are a loyal member of the party, you will vote that candidate in. And so Americans are feeling disenfranchised, starting especially with that lie about Saddam's nuclear weapons. More and more Americans are now aware of the possibility that the government is lying about things. And once people are aware that government does lie, the lies start to become really, really obvious. And it's only a matter of time before you have this grand awakening across the globe, as Zbigniew Brzezinski put it. Of course, from his point of view, that's a bad thing. They don't want the world's population to wake up and realize that the pretensions to democracy and republic are all an illusion to keep us obediently working and feeding that system. But I think if you go on out there and don't rely on my website and certainly don't take my word for anything, if there's one victory that we have in the independent media, first of all, we've taken away the government's ability to lie to the public with impunity. And they don't know what to do without that because they have ruled with lies, fraud, and deception for so long, they don't actually know any other way to run a government. But more importantly, people are no longer relying on the TV network news. In fact, latest polls are showing that confidence and trust in corporate media and government is at an all-time record low. People are learning to trust themselves over that talking head on the TV set. And they're going on out and they're reading and they're figuring things out for themselves, and they're coming pretty much to the same conclusions I have at my website. And that's a very healthy thing because I believe a skeptical people are a free people. And especially looking at the reactions to the shooting in Orlando, the government and the corporate media are still out there trying to push the official story. But if you look at comments on the various news articles, and articles in the independent media. At this point, everybody is just assuming this was another false flag because there have been so many of them. The Boston bombings, Sandy Hook, Columbine. And in fact, Fox News was even commenting that the authorities in Florida aren't saying anything at all about what happened at the Pulse. And he was scratching his head and saying, we wonder why. Well, to me, the answer is obvious. Everything they've put out so far is instantly ripped to shreds and shown to be a fraud and a hoax here in the independent media. So at this point, they're actually scared to say anything at all. And so we are coming up, I think, on a major transition and a shift in our society. I'm hoping it will be peaceful. I'm hoping it'll be calm. I'm hoping people are not going to be harmed by it. But, you know, the potential for chaos is definitely there. But again, you don't need to convince your family that our politicians are crooked or that Wall Street is filled with fraudsters. The preparations that you make for political and economic upheaval are virtually the same that you do for a natural disaster. So just tell them that's what it's for. We're prepping for a possible natural disaster. We're prepping for, you know, the power plant to just spontaneously explode, or the water supply to all of a sudden be contaminated, because these things can happen through accident and stupidity as easily as from acts of terror. Look what happened in Japan with the quake and tsunami that destroyed Fukushima. Bad things happen. You don't even need to detail what they really are. If your family doesn't want to hear about what's going on economically and politically, you don't need to convince them. Just reframe the preparations in terms of the things that everybody agrees do, in fact, occur over time.
Well, those are words of wisdom, and it makes a lot of sense. And I've experienced that myself, too, when you're looking at like whether or not to purchase a backup power generator, for example. The fact that you really can have disruptions due to storms, due to any other, you know, even we get a lot of construction going on in our part of the area, and a backhoe can punch through a cable pretty easily, or a gas line or whatever, and really set you back as far as the things that you depend on coming to you through outside channels. So having that cushion, that pantry, and that other source of heat, source of water, and so on, knowing that you can ride those things out, just is common sense. So
it really is. It really is.
Well, Mike Rivero, founder of WhatReallyHappened.com, just thank you so much again for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
Well, thank you for having me again. I look forward to the next time.